Hello, all you peoples out there. Welcome to our class on the chapters of Moses. And this morning we're going to be in the book of Deuteronomy. Just to recap a little bit, you remember that the theme of the book of Numbers had to do with the rebellion in the wilderness. And the actual title of the book of Numbers in the Hebrew text is In the Wilderness. And that in the wilderness section actually mostly applies to Numbers chapter 10, verse 22, through Numbers chapter 22, verse 1. And in that section there, you have about 38 years of the 40 years of wandering. And the word rebellion, the word grumbling, the word complaining, the words quarreling, they're key words through that section. And because of their rebellion in the wilderness, until they came to the plains of Moab, and Moab is the mountainous area that's right across the Jordan River from Jericho. But until they came to the plains of Moab, their rebellion cost the lives of all of that first generation of men that were 20 years old and upward, except for Joshua and Caleb. And then, of course, you have the second numbering in Numbers chapter 26 of the new generation, and they're encamped in the plains of Moab. And then the book of Deuteronomy is actually a sermon. It is Moses' final sermon. Notice the first verse of Deuteronomy. These are the words. These are the words, Dibarim. This is the message. These are the words. This is the Hebrew title of the book of Deuteronomy. Later on in the Greek Old Testament, many centuries later, it was called Deuteronomy because Deutero means second, nomos means law, so it's kind of like a second giving of the law because Moses repeats a lot of the commandments of the law in his sermon, his farewell sermon to the people in the book of Deuteronomy. And Joshua has been appointed as a new leader. So if you'll read in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 3, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. And so here you're right at the end of the time, right before Moses goes up the mountain and dies, and right before the people go across the river. Now, rather than trying to go through every passage in the book of Deuteronomy, I'd like to give you some phrases that are repeated that sort of capture the spirit of the book of Deuteronomy. One of the phrases that you'll see repeated in the book is the phrase, "Hear, O Israel." For example, go to chapter 5 and verse 1. Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, O Israel. All the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today." Chapter 6 and verse 3, which is right before what's called the Shema. The Shema means hear. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey. Chapter 6, verse 4, which is part of this passage that the Jews repeated every day in a memorized way. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, etc. Go to chapter 9 of the book. Verse 1, "Hear, O Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan and go in and dispossess the nations." See? Listen, Israel. Hear, O Israel. There was an old preacher that used to preach on the radio. I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure what his name was, but he used to say, "Are you listening? Are you listening?" And this is really pretty much what this phrase means as Moses preaches to the new generation. The old generation didn't listen. But he says, please hear, please listen, O Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 3. Hear, O Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Deuteronomy chapter 29. Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 4. He says, But to this day the Lord has given you a mind that has not given you a mind that understands, or eyes that see, or ears that hear. Many of you may remember Jesus in his teaching saying, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, some of that goes all the way back to this passage and a passage in Isaiah, but Moses was telling the people, please listen, hear, O Israel. Will you listen to this lesson? Too bad that many times when somebody's telling us God's word or telling us what God says, we don't listen, we don't hear. But Moses, throughout his sermon, and that's what the book of Deuteronomy is, it's a sermon. He keeps pleading with Israel, hear, O Israel. So that's phrase number 1 for your consideration. A second phrase that occurs throughout the book of Deuteronomy in this sermon that Moses gives is the phrase, with all of your heart, with all of your soul. If you look in chapter 6 and verse 5, chapter 6 and verse 5, this is part of the Shema, which they quoted every day, but he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. Well, of course, the Lord Jesus quoted that in the Gospel of Luke when he was telling the story of the Good Samaritan, and he said, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. But there's more to it than that. That is a theme in the book of Deuteronomy. God didn't want people just to half-heartedly punch their ticket and not really care about God or doing his will. He wanted them to do his will with all their heart, with all their soul. He wanted a real relationship between him and his people. Look at chapter 10 of Deuteronomy and verse 12. Here he says, and now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, and to walk in his ways, and to love him, and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. See, don't just do a couple of things grudgingly, but really serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Look at chapter 11 with me in verse 13. So if you faithfully obey the commands I'm giving you today, to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season. God wanted to bless this people, but he wanted more than lip service. He wanted more than action that punched a ticket. He wanted all their heart and all their soul. Look at chapter 11 and verse 18. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads, much like he says in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5 through 9. Look at chapter 13 of Deuteronomy and verse 3. He's talking about if they listen to false prophets. He says, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord is testing you to find out whether you will love him with all your heart and with all of your soul. Because if you love the Lord with all of your heart and your soul, you're not going to turn against the Lord's word and do something that some false prophet tells you that you know goes against God's word. So do it with all your heart and with all your soul. You know, when Jesus was talking to that woman at the well about worshiping him in spirit and truth, when he's worship with your spirit, he means with your whole being, with all your heart and with your soul. And he's really talking about the same idea that you have all the way through Deuteronomy in Moses' sermon. So one of the phrases, as we pointed out earlier in this great sermon, thematic, is, please listen, hear, O Israel. A second phrase is, love the Lord and serve the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul. This is a key stuff in the preaching that Moses was so desperately doing, knowing that he would not go into the land of Canaan, but that he would go up on the mountains of Moab in Mount Nebo, across from the Dead Sea, and he would die there and never enter into the land of Canaan. All right, number 3, there is a phrase that occurs numerous times in the book of Deuteronomy in Moses' sermon, and that is, put away the evil that is among you. Some of you who are reading the NIV may have it translated, purge the evil that is among you. Paul, in fact, quoted this line, this thematic passage from Deuteronomy, in his lesson to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, when he talked to them about withdrawing their fellowship from this man that was openly and rebelliously living with his father's wife. And at the very last verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's verse 13, God will judge those on the outside. Expel the evil from among you. Expel the wicked man from among you. And of course, this is a quote from Deuteronomy in a number of different passages. Let's look at some of those places in Deuteronomy. Now, remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, the point was this. You're supposed to worship God and God alone. You're supposed to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. When you go into this pagan land and you possess this land, you're not supposed to make covenants with these pagan people, and you're supposed to tear down their idols, and you're not supposed to let the evil stay among you. You're not supposed to intermarry with these idolatrous people. You're supposed to purge the evil that is among you. So look with me at Deuteronomy 17, verse 7. He's talking about people that have done something that's deserving of the death penalty. It says, the hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting him to death, and then the hands of all the people. You must purge the evil from among you. Now drop down to verse 12. It's talking about another particular sin that the people would do. If people would show contempt for God's law or for the priest that was ministering, it says they must be put to death. You must purge the evil from among you. That's actually chapter 17, verse 12. Then look at chapter 19 with me, Deuteronomy 19. And let's look down at verse 13. Let's start with verse 11. 19:11. If a man hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him and assaults and kills him, then flees to one of the cities, the elders of this town shall send for him, bring him back from the city, and hand him over to the avenger of blood to die. Show him no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding blood, so that it may go well with you. All right? Now, go to chapter 22, verse 21 and 22. Chapter 22, verse 21 and 22. She shall be brought, this is talking about a girl who has supposedly violated a marriage. And it says, if the charge is true and no proof of the girl's virginity shall be found, this is Deuteronomy 22:20, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of her town shall stone her to death. She has done a disgraceful thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. Look at verse 22. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from among you. Go down to the end of verse 23. He's talking about another sexual violation. He says, you must it's the end of verse 24. You must purge the evil from among you. Turn over at Deuteronomy chapter 24. And let's look at verse 7. If a man is caught kidnapping one of his brother Israelites and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. And of course, this phrase just occurs over and over again. I'm just showing you some of the cases. What's the point? Well, the point is, and Moses makes it exceedingly well in the sermon in the book of Deuteronomy, is you can't allow evil to openly coexist with in a situation where you're trying to do the will of God, because evil will corrupt the rest. It's the same as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. See? One bad apple will spoil the whole bunch if you leave it in there. It will. So you've got to put away the evil from among you, not tolerate it and let it grow and let it fester and let it get worse and worse. This is still a message that if Moses were alive today, he'd be preaching to the church today. You need to put away the evil from among you and not just ignore the evil. Another of the thematic phrases that holds this great sermon in Deuteronomy together is the phrase, beware lest you forget. And of course it's translated in a little bit different way in different versions, but look with me, if you will, to chapter 4 and verse 9. Now, the way this phrase is used in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses goes back and reminds this new generation of stuff that happened that you can read about in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, and how the people rebelled against God in this case or that case. And he says, now beware that you don't forget that and what happened there, so that you repeat the same mistakes. See? So he says in Deuteronomy 4 verse 9, be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip away from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children. And see, he has just told them in chapter 4 to be careful to obey God's laws. And then he says in chapter 4 verse 2, do not add to what I command you. Do not subtract from it. Keep the commands of the Lord your God. He reminds them of what happened in Numbers 25 when they went to that idolatrous feast with the Moabites, and there ended up being 24,000 of them killed that day because of their compromise. And that's when he says, beware lest you forget. Don't do that same thing, make that same mistake again when you go into the land. Look at chapter 6 and let's look at verse 12. Chapter 6 verse 12. Let's start with verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, a land, large, flourishing cities you did not build. Verse 11, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. And when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. See, it's easy to forget, isn't it? If we're not reminded over and over and over again. You know, some people have said, well, we really need a Bible study. Why do we really need classes? You know, why do we really need so much Bible study? And the answer is in this phrase. Beware lest you forget. We need to be reminded continually of what God has said. You ought to pay the more earnest heed to the things that you have heard, lest you drift away from them. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Hebrews 3, verse 12. Be careful, brothers, lest there be in any of you a evil, unfaithful heart in falling away from the living God. So that's why we need to beware. In Hebrews chapter 8, when he tells them if they go into the land, and in verse 10 he says, when you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you, and be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God and fail to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Moses is warning the people in this lesson over and over again. It's his last chance to try to make these people listen as he goes up and dies and lets Joshua lead them into the land. In chapter 9, verse 7, when he's reminding them of what happened when he was up on the mountain and how they built the golden calf and worshiped it, and Aaron helped them, he says in 9:7, remember this and never forget how you provoked the Lord your God to anger in the desert. And remember what happened there so you don't do the same things again. But of course they didn't remember. They did forget. And they did provoke the Lord. And it ended up being their downfall in the end. So beware. Remember that you do not forget. See, this is one of the thematic strands that goes throughout the sermon in the book of Deuteronomy. So, hear, O Israel, please listen, Moses says. You need to love and serve God with all your heart and with all your soul, Moses says. Beware lest you forget what happened when you didn't obey the Lord. And this phrase, put away the evil from among you. Don't let evil stay among you. These are some of the points that Moses brings up over and over and over in the book of Deuteronomy. Now there's another one that's repeated often in the book of Deuteronomy, and this is actually a phrase that has its origin back when the Ten Commandments were given in the book of Exodus. If you want to turn back real quickly to Exodus chapter 20, Exodus chapter 20, where you have the Ten Commandments. You can see here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, Paul said that this was the first commandment that had a promise attached to it. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother. Now watch this part. So that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. So God promised that if you keep His commandments, I'll let you live in this land for a long, long time. But of course the opposite was true. If you don't do my will, and if you turn against me and you disobey me, then I'll kick you out of your land and let your enemies overtake you. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 16. This is a repetition of that command to honor your father and mother. And he says, honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. See, he's telling the new generation that if you want to keep this new land, then you need to do this. Look at chapter 5, verse 33. Walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. Interesting, huh? I'm going to give you this land. But if you want to stay in this land, if you want to do well and live long in the land, then this is what you need to do. Let's try chapter 6, verse 3. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and you may increase greatly in the land, flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord promised you. Let's look at chapter 16 of Deuteronomy. And I'm surely missing instances of this. I'm just showing you some of the places where these things recur. But chapter 16 and verse 20. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land that the Lord your God is giving you. See, if you want to live in this land, you need to have justice and justice for all. And our land has been going through some discussions about equal justice for all people. And God told them, if you want to live in the land of Canaan, you better treat everyone justly, from the fatherless and the widow to the richest person or the most powerful person. You better do justice if you want to live long in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 19. Here he's talking about, let's see here, 23:19. Let's see if I got the wrong verse here. Well, it's actually 19 and 20. He says, do not charge your brother interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a brother Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you are entering to possess. In many of these commands, in many of these decrees that Moses was preaching. This is God's law. This is God's will. He attaches this phrase to it, that it may go well with you, and you may live long in the land which the Lord your God has given you. So, do we want it to go well with us? You know, later on in the Psalms, many of us may not realize this when we read the Psalms, but in Psalm 37, there's a phrase that's repeated that really kind of goes back to this teaching of the law of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, where he says that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land. Look at Psalm 37, verse 9. For evil men will be cut off, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. In other words, you'll live long in the land. Look at verse 11 in Psalm 37. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy great peace. In other words, if you're gentle, it'll go well with you and you'll live long in the land. Look at Psalm 37:22. Those whom the Lord blesses will inherit the land. See, you'll get to stay in the land. He's talking about the land of Canaan. Look at verse 27, Psalm 37:27. Turn from evil and do good, then you will dwell in the land forever. So remember the Deuteronomy phrase, which the psalmist is picking up here, that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land, which the Lord your God has given you. Look at Psalm 37:29. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. So, you know, Jesus' sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, blessed are the gentle or the meek, for they shall inherit the land. He's citing Psalm 37, and he's also citing the law in Deuteronomy. Says, do God's will, and it'll go well with you, and you will live long in the land. Okay? So, the bones that hold the book of Deuteronomy and this sermon of Moses together is, hear, O Israel, listen to this. You need to pay attention. You got to love and serve the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul. You can't let evil live among you. It'll infect you. Put away the evil from you. Beware lest you forget the mistakes of your fathers and make those same mistakes. If you'll do the Lord's will, and only if you do His will, it will go well with you and you will live long in the land. Moses summarizes the sermon, in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 28, where you have a series of blessings and curses, but most particularly in Deuteronomy 28, you have what's called the blessings and the curses. In fact, later on in the book of Joshua, when it tells you that Joshua read the whole law to the people, the whole Pentateuch to the people, it says including the blessings and the curses. Well, the blessings and the curses are what's found at the latter part of his sermon here in Deuteronomy 28. Notice, pardon me, in Deuteronomy 28:1. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all His commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations on the earth, and all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you will obey the Lord your God. You'll be blessed in the city, blessed in the country, etc. See? That's another way of saying it'll go well with you and you'll dwell long in the land. But if you drop down to verse 15, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all His commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come upon you. And if you read the rest of this chapter, it's like a forecast of the rest of the Old Testament, of what's going to happen to these people if they don't do the will of God. I suggest that you read the book of Deuteronomy. And I suggest that you read it in the context of the skeleton that holds it together, which is these phrases. Hear, O Israel, love Him and serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul. Beware lest you forget. Put away that evil from among you. Do God's will so that it may go well. Read the book of Deuteronomy and read it in the context of this skeleton that holds it together.
Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love, from above, came to earth to show the Father's love, and I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. For I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name.